Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep, letting these stories guide you into the darkness of dreams. Before you drift off tonight, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps me bring you more cases like this one. Now let's get comfortable, relax, take a deep breath, and dive into tonight's case. Tonight we're traveling back to 1884 to Austin, Texas, a city that was supposed to be a beacon of progress and civilization in the American frontier. But something sinister was lurking in the shadows of this growing capital city. Something that would terrorize an entire community for over a year. Something that would leave 8 women brutally murdered and 8 others barely clinging to life. This is the story of America's first recognized serial killer. A faceless monster who prowled the darkness, targeting the most vulnerable members of society with a savagery that shocked the nation. This is the story of the Austin servant girl annihilator. Established peaceful setting Austin, Texas in 1884 was a city on the rise. The state capital had a population of just over 17,000 people, and it was growing every month. Gas lamps lined the main streets downtown, casting warm glows against the limestone buildings that housed banks, hotels, and mercantile shops. The new Capitol building was being planned, a magnificent structure that would soon tower over the city as a symbol of Texas pride and prosperity. The Colorado River flowed gently through the heart of Austin, providing water and commerce. Horse-drawn carriages clattered along Congress Avenue. Church bells rang on Sunday mornings. Families gathered on porches in the evening heat, fanning themselves and gossiping about politics, weather, and the latest news from the telegraph office. It was a city divided, as most southern cities were in those days, racially, economically, socially. The wealthy white families lived in grand homes north of the river. The working class, both white and black, lived in smaller homes and boarding houses scattered throughout the city. And the servant class, mostly young black women, lived in tiny quarters behind the homes of their employers, in what were called servant houses or outbuildings. These servant houses were simple structures, 1 or 2 rooms, wood planks, tin roofs, no locks on the doors because servants were expected to be available at all hours. They sat at the back of the property, separated from the main house by yards, gardens, and darkness. It was in these vulnerable spaces that the terror would begin. Life seemed normal, peaceful, predictable. But in the final days of 1884, that peace would be shattered forever. Introduced the first disturbance on the night of December 30th, 1884. Something terrible happened in the darkness of Austin. A scream pierced the quiet air, then another, then silence. The next morning, a young black woman named Molly Smith was found in her servant house behind the home of Walter Hall on West Pekin Street. She was lying in a pool of blood, her head crushed by something heavy and brutal. Her skull had been fractured. Her face was nearly unrecognizable. She was still alive, barely. Next to her in the same soaked room lay a man named Walter Spencer. He was Molly's companion, though the nature of their relationship was never made entirely clear in the reports. Walter had also been attacked. His head had been split open with the same savage force. He was unconscious, but breathing. Neighbors had heard the screams, but they had not come to help. In that era, in that divided city, the screams of a black servant woman in the night were often ignored. It was assumed to be a domestic dispute. It was assumed to be someone else's problem. By the time someone finally checked on the servant house the next morning, it was too late. Molly Smith died from her injuries. Walter Spencer survived, but he had no memory of what happened. He remembered going to sleep. He remembered waking up in agony, covered in blood, unable to see or think clearly. Everything in between was gone, erased by trauma and violence. The police were called. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. The door to the servant house had been left open, swinging gently in the cold winter breeze. The weapon was never found, but the police believed it had been an axe or some similar. Something heavy, something meant to kill. The investigation was brief. The victim was a black servant woman. The survivor was a black man with no memory. There were no witnesses, no suspects, no clear motive. The case was filed away as an unsolved murder. The city moved on. But the killer had only just begun. Molly Smith was 25 years old when she died. She had been born into slavery in the final years of the Civil War, and she had grown up in the Reconstruction South, a world of broken promises and hard survival. Like so many young black women of her generation, Molly had few options in life. She could work as a servant, a cook, a washerwoman, or a field hand. She chose domestic service because it was considered safer, more stable, more respectable. She worked for the Hall family, a white household on West Pekin Street. She cooked their meals, she cleaned their floors, she washed their clothes. She woke before dawn and worked until late at night, and in exchange, she was given a small room in the servant house out back, a few dollars a month, and leftover food from the family table. Molly was described by those who knew her as quiet, hardworking, and kind. She kept to herself. She attended church on Sundays when her employers allowed it. She had dreams, though no one bothered to record what they were. Perhaps she hoped to save enough money to buy a small piece of land. Perhaps she dreamed of marriage, a family, a life of her own. She had a companion, Walter Spencer. Whether they were married, engaged, or simply together is unclear. The newspapers of the time did not consider the personal lives of black servants worthy of detailed reporting. But they lived together in that small servant house, and they cared for each other in a world that offered them very little safety or kindness. Molly did not deserve what happened to her. She was not involved in crime. She had no enemies that anyone knew of. She was simply a young woman trying to survive in a world that had been built to exploit her labor and ignore her humanity. And on the night of December 30th, 1884, someone crept into her home while she slept and beat her to death. Walter Spencer was in his early 30s. He worked odd jobs around Austin, hauling goods, repairing fences, doing whatever labor was available. He was known as a steady, reliable worker. He didn't drink heavily. He didn't get into fights. He kept his head down and tried to earn an honest living in a city that offered black men very few honest opportunities. Walter and Molly had been together for some time, though the exact details of their relationship were never documented. They lived together in the servant house behind the Hall property, sharing the tiny space and the hard life that came with it. On the night of the attack, Walter remembered very little. He remembered lying down to sleep beside Molly. He remembered the warmth of the small fire they had built to ward off the December cold. He remembered the sound of the wind outside, and then nothing. When he woke, he was blind. His skull had been fractured, blood was everywhere. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He heard voices, distant, muffled, frightened. He felt hands lifting him. He heard someone say Molly's name, and then he lost consciousness again. Walter survived, but he was never the same. The blow to his head had caused permanent damage. His vision never fully returned. His memory of that night remained blank. He could not identify the attacker. He could not explain what had happened. The police questioned him, but he had no answers, and so the case went cold. In the weeks following Molly Smith's murder, the city of Austin tried to return to normal. The newspapers gave the story only a few lines. Niggers killed in servant house, brutal attack on Pekin Street. The coverage was minimal, the concern even less so. In the rigid racial hierarchy of 1884 Texas, the death of a black servant woman was not considered a matter of great public importance. But there were whispers in the black community, where people knew Molly, where people knew Walter, where people understood that someone had crept into a home in the dead of night and committed an act of unspeakable violence, and had walked away without a trace. There were whispers among the white families who employed black servants. A nagging question: if it could happen to Molly Smith, could it happen to their servants? And if their servants were in danger, did that mean their own households were vulnerable? But these whispers did not lead to action. There was no widespread investigation, no community meetings, no demands for justice. Life went on. The gas lamps were lit each evening. The church bells rang each Sunday. The servants continued their work, sleeping in their small, unlocked-out buildings, trusting that the world would not be so cruel as to visit them with violence in the night. And then, it happened again. Dropped small hints of doom. On the night of May 6, 1885, more than 4 months after Molly Smith's murder, another scream tore through the darkness. This time, it came from a servant house on the property of William Dunham, located on Hickory Street. The victim was a young black woman named Eliza Shelley. She was found the next morning in the same horrific condition as Molly Smith. Her head had been crushed. Her body was covered in blood. The weapon appeared to be an axe, though once again, it was never found. But this time there was something different. Eliza Shelley had not been killed in her sleep. She had been dragged. Her body was found outside the servant house, in the yard, near a small clump of trees. There were signs of a struggle. The ground was torn up. Blood was smeared across the dirt. It appeared that she had been attacked inside the house, had tried to escape, and had been dragged back and killed in the open air. There was also evidence of sexual assault, though the newspapers of the time were vague and euphemistic in their descriptions. They used phrases like outrage and violation to describe what had been done to her. Eliza Shelley was 25 years old. She had been a cook for the Dunham family. She was known as cheerful and hardworking. She had friends in the neighborhood. She attended the same church as Molly Smith had. And now she was dead. The police were called again. They examined the scene again. They found no witnesses again. They had no suspects again. But this time, they could not ignore the pattern. 2 black servant women. Both attacked in their servant houses at night. Both killed with brutal head trauma. Both assaulted in ways that suggested rage, hatred, and something darker, something sexual, something sadistic. The whispers grew louder. This was not random. This was not a coincidence. Someone was hunting. Eliza Shelley had been born in the countryside outside of Austin, the daughter of formerly enslaved parents who had stayed in Texas after emancipation, hoping to build a new life in freedom. That life had been harder than anyone had promised. Eliza's parents worked as sharecroppers, trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency that was barely distinguishable from the slavery they had escaped. Eliza had watched them age too quickly. Their backs bent from endless labor, their hopes slowly crushed under the weight of a system designed to keep them poor and powerless. She had come to Austin when she was 18, looking for something better. Domestic service in the city seemed like an opportunity, a chance to earn her own money, to live with a measure of independence, to escape the brutal monotony of field work. She found employment with the Dunham family, a respectable white household on Hickory Street. She cooked their meals with skill and care. She kept their kitchen spotless. She was known for her warm smile and her singing voice. She would hum hymns while she worked, filling the kitchen with soft, joyful music. The Dunhams considered her a valued member of their household. They paid her regularly. They allowed her Sundays off. They spoke well of her to their neighbors. But like Molly Smith, Eliza lived in a small servant house at the back of the property. It was perhaps 15 feet from the main house, close enough to be called if needed, far enough to maintain the social distance that was expected in that era. The door had no lock. The windows had no bars. Eliza slept alone in that vulnerable space, trusting that the world would leave her in peace. She had friends in the neighborhood, other servants, other young black women who shared her circumstances. They would visit each other on their rare free hours, sitting on porch steps, sharing gossip and laughter and small comforts. She had been planning to attend a church social the weekend after she was killed. She had saved a little money to buy fabric for a new dress. She had talked excitedly about it with her friends just days before her death. Eliza Shelley had dreams. She had a future. She had people who loved her. And on the night of May 6, 1885, someone took all of that away from her. After Eliza Shelley's murder, the Austin police could no longer dismiss these deaths as isolated incidents. 2 murders, both black servant women. Both attacked at night in their servant houses. Both killed with extreme violence, skulls crushed, bodies brutalized. Both cases involved an attacker who left no clear evidence, no witnesses, no trace of his presence beyond the horror he inflicted. The police chief, James Lucy, called a meeting with his officers. They reviewed the cases side by side, looking for connections. The victims were both young black women in their mid-20s. Both worked as domestic servants for white families. Both lived in small outbuildings behind their employers' homes. Both were attacked in the deepest hours of the night, when the city was asleep and the darkness was total. The weapon in both cases appeared to be an axe or a similar heavy, bladed implement. The blows were delivered with tremendous force, enough to shatter bone, to cause immediate incapacitation, to ensure that the victims could not cry out for help or defend themselves. But there were differences too. Molly Smith had been attacked alongside Walter Spencer, who had survived. Eliza Shelley had been alone, and there had been signs of sexual assault, an element that had not been present, or at least not reported, in the first case. Still, the similarities were too striking to ignore. Chief Lucy made a decision. He assigned additional officers to patrol the neighborhoods where servant houses were common. He urged white employers to take precautions, to lock their doors, to keep weapons handy, to watch for suspicious activity. But notably, he did not urge the servants themselves to take precautions. He did not suggest that they be given locks for their doors, or that they be allowed to sleep in safer locations. The idea that black servants deserved protection as individuals, rather than as property of their employers, did not seem to occur to the authorities. The newspapers began to pay more attention. The Austin Daily Statesman ran a small article, "Second Servant Girl Murdered, Police Baffled." The city was beginning to realize that something terrible was happening, but the worst was still to come. On the night of May 23, 1885, just 17 days after Eliza Shelley's murder, the killer struck again. This time the victim was Irene Cross, a black servant woman who worked for the Moses Johnson family on Cypress Street. Irene was in her early 20s. She was petite, soft-spoken, and deeply religious. She attended prayer meetings every Wednesday night and sang in the choir at the First Baptist Church for Colored. She sent money home to her mother, who lived in the countryside and was too old to work. On the night of May 23rd, Irene went to bed in her small servant house as usual. The night was warm and humid, typical for late May in Texas. She left her window open to catch any breeze that might offer relief from the heat. Sometime around midnight, a neighbor heard a scream. It was sharp and sudden, cut off almost as soon as it began. The neighbor, a white man named Thomas Green who lived in the house adjacent to the Johnson property, sat up in bed listening. He heard nothing more. He assumed it had been a cat, or perhaps a nightmare, or perhaps nothing at all. He went back to sleep. The next morning, when Irene did not appear at the main house to start breakfast, Mrs. Johnson sent one of her children to fetch her. The child returned, pale and shaking. Irene Cross was lying on the floor of her servant house, unconscious and covered in blood. Her head had been struck repeatedly. The floor was slick with blood. The window, the one she had left open to catch the breeze, was still open. Someone had climbed through it in the darkness. Irene was still alive when they found her, but barely. She was rushed to a doctor, who did what he could to treat her wounds. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. She had defensive wounds on her hands and arms. She had tried to fight back. She survived the attack. But like Walter Spencer before her, Irene could remember almost nothing. She remembered going to sleep. She remembered a sound, maybe footsteps, maybe breathing, maybe the creak of the window frame. And then she remembered pain and darkness, and nothing else. She could not describe the attacker. She did not know if it had been one person or more. She could not say why she had been targeted. Irene Cross lived, but she was permanently damaged. The injuries left her with chronic headaches, memory problems, and a fear of the dark that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The police investigated. They found no evidence, no fingerprints. Forensic science was still in its infancy, and fingerprinting was not yet used by American law enforcement. No footprints in the soft earth outside the window. No weapon left behind. But they did find something strange. A piece of fabric, torn and bloody, caught on a nail near the window frame. It appeared to be from a man's shirt, rough cotton, dark-collared common. It was the first physical clue the killer had left behind, but it led nowhere. There were thousands of men in Austin who wore shirts of that type. It could have been anyone. 3 attacks. 2 deaths. 1 survivor with no memory. 1 survivor with permanent injuries. All black servant women. All in their servant houses. The pattern was undeniable now. The newspapers began to use a term that would stick: the servant girl murders. Editorials appeared, demanding action. "Our city is under siege by a fiend," one wrote. "The authorities must act swiftly to protect our servants and restore order." But the focus always was on the servants as property, as valuable household assets that needed protection, not as human beings whose lives mattered in their own right. The black community was terrified. Churches held special prayer meetings. Pastors preached about the presence of evil in the world and the need for vigilance. Families began to pull their daughters and sisters out of domestic service, despite the economic hardship it caused. Servant women who could not afford to quit their jobs began sleeping in pairs or groups, crowding into the small outbuildings for safety in numbers. Some white employers, to their credit, began allowing their servants to sleep inside the main house at night. Though this was controversial, the racial boundaries of the era made the idea of black servants sleeping under the same roof as white families deeply uncomfortable to many. Locks were installed on some servant house doors, though not all employers were willing to pay for them. The police increased their patrols, but Austin was a large city with limited law enforcement resources. There were only a handful of officers on duty at any given time, and they could not be everywhere at once. The killer had the advantage. He struck in darkness. He chose victims who were isolated and vulnerable. He left no evidence. He disappeared like smoke, and he was not done. In the weeks following the attack on Arene Cross, the city held its breath. People began to notice things they had overlooked before. Strange men seen walking through neighborhoods at odd hours. Shadows moving in alleys. The sound of footsteps that stopped when you turned around. Paranoia set in. Every unexplained noise became a potential threat. Every stranger became a potential suspect. The darkness itself seemed hostile, filled with unseen danger. Neighbors began to watch each other with suspicion. Old grudges resurfaced. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some people blamed outsiders, drifters, hobos, men who rode the rails into Austin and camped in the woods along the river. Vigilante groups began to form, patrolling the streets at night with lanterns and shotguns, ready to shoot first and ask questions later. Others blamed the victims themselves, whispering that perhaps they had brought themselves through some moral failing, some secret sin. This was the ugly logic of victim blaming, always ready to excuse the perpetrator and condemn the innocent. But the killer cared nothing for rumors or vigilantes or blame. He was already planning his next move. On the night of August 30th, 1885, the killer escalated. For the first time, he attacked 2 victims in a single night. The targets were Rebecca Ramey, a 30-year-old black cook, and her 11-year-old daughter Mary Ramey. They lived together in a servant house on the property of Valentine O. Wheat, a prominent white businessman whose home was located on San Marcos Street, in a neighborhood that had previously felt safe from the terror. Rebecca was a widow. Her husband had died 2 years earlier in a construction accident, leaving her to raise Mary alone. She worked long hours to support them both. She was known as an excellent cook, specializing in the kind of rich, traditional Southern food that white families craved: fried chicken, cornbread, greens cooked with ham hock, pecan pies. Mary was a bright, curious child. She helped her mother with small tasks around the kitchen. She loved to read, though she had little access to books. She dreamed of becoming a teacher someday, of escaping the cycle of domestic service that had claimed her mother's life. They slept together in the servant house, a single room with 2 small beds, a wood stove, and a few personal belongings. The door had a simple latch, but no lock. On the night of August 30th, the heat was oppressive. The temperature had barely dropped after sunset, and the air was thick and still. Rebecca and Mary went to bed late, both exhausted from the day's work. Sometime after midnight, someone opened the door of their servant house. The hinges creaked softly. Rebecca woke instantly. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The room was dark, so dark she could barely see her own hand in front of her face. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sharp with fear. No answer. She heard breathing, heavy, deliberate. She reached for Mary, intending to wake her, to hide her, to protect her. But before she could move, something struck her across the head. The blow was devastating. She felt her skull crack. The world exploded into pain and light, and then darkness. She fell back onto the bed, blood pouring from the wound. Mary woke to the sound of her mother's scream, a wet, choking sound that was cut off almost immediately. The child opened her eyes and saw a shape in the darkness. A man, tall, holding something in his hands, something long and heavy. She tried to scream. but terror had stolen her voice. The man turned toward her. Mary scrambled out of bed, her small bare feet hitting the wooden floor. She ran for the door, moving on pure instinct, driven by the most primal human urge to survive. She made it 3 steps before the man caught her. He grabbed her by her nightgown and pulled her back. She kicked and clawed, fighting with everything she had, but she was a child, small, weak, terrified. The man raised his weapon. Mary saw it coming. She raised her arms to protect her head. The axe came down. It struck her on the left side of her skull, just above her ear. The force of the blow sent her sprawling to the floor. Blood poured from the wound, hot and thick, soaking her nightgown, pooling on the floor beneath her. The man stood over her for a moment, breathing hard, and then he left. He walked out the door into the darkness and vanished. The servant house was silent except for the sound of dripping, blood dripping from the beds onto the floor. The air smelled of copper and sweat and violence. The darkness was absolute, no moon, no stars, no light from the main house. Just blackness, thick and suffocating. Rebecca lay on her bed, unconscious, her chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular breaths. The wound in her head was catastrophic. Blood matted her hair and soaked the pillow beneath her. Mary lay on the floor, curled on her side, her small body trembling. She was still conscious, barely. The pain was beyond anything she had ever imagined. She wanted to call for her mother, but she couldn't form the words. She wanted to escape, but her body wouldn't obey. She could hear the dripping. Drip. Drip. She could feel the warmth of her own blood spreading across the floor, soaking into the rough wood. She could smell the iron scent of it, mingling with the smell of the wood stove and her mother's cooking, and the faint perfume of the honeysuckle that grew outside the window. She tried to stay awake. She tried to hold on, but the darkness was pulling at her, dragging her down. She closed her eyes. Mary would later say, years later, when she had grown into a woman and the scars on her skull had faded to white lines beneath her hair, that the worst part was not the pain. The worst part was the silence. The way the man had said nothing, no words, no explanation, no rage or anger or emotion of any kind. He had simply come into their home, attacked them with brutal efficiency and left, as if they were nothing, as if their lives meant nothing, as if killing them was no more significant than swatting a fly. That silence haunted her more than anything else, because it meant that the man who had tried to kill her did not see her as human. She was not a child with dreams and hopes and future. She was just a target. The screams had been heard by a neighbor, a white man named Dr. Lucian Johnson, who lived in the house next door to the Weed property. Dr. Johnson had been awake, reading by lamplight in his study. He heard the scream, high-pitched, terrified, abruptly silenced. He set down his book and listened. He heard nothing more. But something about that scream unsettled him. It had not sounded like a nightmare or a domestic argument. It had sounded like mortal terror. He put on his coat and took his lantern. He walked outside into the humid night and made his way toward the Weed property. He called out, "Hello. Is everything all right?" No answer. He approached the servant house. The door was open, swinging slightly in the faint breeze. He raised his lantern and stepped inside. The light fell across the scene of carnage. Rebecca lying on the bed, her head a mass of blood and broken bone. Mary lying on the floor, so small and still that for a moment Johnson thought she was already dead. He knelt beside the child. He felt for a pulse. It was there, faint, thready. But dear God, he whispered. He ran back to his house and sent his wife to wake the police. Then he returned to the servant house with blankets and bandages, doing what he could to stop the bleeding, to stabilize the victims until help arrived. Rebecca never regained consciousness. She died 2 hours later, without ever opening her eyes, without ever knowing if her daughter had survived. Mary held on. The doctors said it was a miracle. The blow had fractured her skull, but it had not penetrated deep enough to destroy her brain. She had lost a tremendous amount of blood, but she was young and strong, and her body fought to survive. She spent weeks in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, fevered and delirious. But she lived, and when she finally woke, when the doctors asked her what she remembered, she told them everything she could. She described the man. Tall, heavy footsteps. The smell of him, sweat and dirt and something else, something chemical. Maybe alcohol or kerosene. She described the weapon long, heavy. An axe, she thought, though she had only seen it for a moment in the darkness. She described the silence, the way he had said nothing, the way he had left without a word. It was the most detailed description any survivor had given. But it was not enough to identify the killer. When the Austin police arrived at the Weed property in the early hours of August 31st, 1885, they found a scene that would become grimly familiar over the coming months. The servant house door stood open. Blood was everywhere, on the beds, on the floor, splattered across the walls in dark arterial sprays. The violence had been extreme, frenzied, personal. But once again there was no sign of forced entry. The door had been unlatched from the inside, suggesting that the killer had simply walked in, or that someone had opened it for him. Chief James Lucy stood in the doorway with his lantern, taking in the scene. He was a veteran lawman, a former Texas Ranger who had seen his share of violence on the frontier. But this was different. This was not a barroom brawl gone wrong or a robbery turned deadly. This was calculated, predatory. "He's getting bolder," Lucy said to his deputy, a young man named Tom Cheneville. A woman and a child. Cheneville, who had a daughter about Mary's age, looked at the blood on the floor and felt his stomach turn. Why would anyone do this? Lucy shook his head. "I don't know. But we're going to find him." It was a promise he would not be able to keep. The investigators documented everything they could see. Though their methods were primitive by modern standards, the beds were soaked with blood. Rebecca's skull had been crushed so severely that fragments of bone were visible in the wound. The pillow beneath her head was torn, as if she had thrashed in her death throes. Mary's blood was in a pool on the floor, still wet and glistening in the lantern light. There were small handprints in the blood where she had tried to push herself up, tried to crawl toward the door. The weapon was not at the scene. The killer had taken it with him, as he always did. But there were footprints. Outside the servant house in the soft dirt of the yard, there were boot prints, large, deep impressions suggesting a heavy man. The prints led away from the servant house, through the yard, and then disappeared when they reached the harder ground near the street. The police made plaster casts of the prints, a new technique that had been recently adopted from European police forces. The cast showed a worn boot with a distinctive pattern on the sole, a herringbone design common to work boots of the era. It was evidence, but it was not particularly useful. Thousands of men in Austin wore boots like that. Missing items and signs of struggle inside the servant house. The police found signs that Mary had fought back. Her fingernails were broken and bloody. There were scratches on the wooden floor where she had clawed at it, trying to pull herself away from her attacker. A small wooden chair near the door had been knocked over. A wash basin had been spilled, water mixing with blood on the floor. But nothing had been stolen. Rebecca's small purse, which contained a few coins and a handkerchief, was still sitting on the shelf where she had left it. Mary's shoes were still neatly placed beside her bed. Whatever the killer's motive was, it was not robbery. This fact troubled the investigators more than anything else. Robber they could understand. Robbery was logical even if it was criminal. But this purposeless violence, this targeting of the most vulnerable people in society for no apparent gain, this was something else entirely. This was the work of a madman, or something worse. Joseph Wooldridge, the city's medical examiner, was called to examine the bodies. Wooldridge was a meticulous man who had studied medicine in Philadelphia before returning to Texas to serve his home state. He approached each case with scientific rigor, believing that evidence, not superstition or speculation, should guide investigations. He examined Rebecca Ramey's body at the scene. The cause of death was obvious. Massive head trauma resulting in catastrophic brain injury and exsanguination, death by bleeding out. The weapon had struck her at least 4 times. The first blow had likely rendered her unconscious. The subsequent blows had been delivered while she was already incapacitated. Overkill, a sign of rage or sexual frenzy. There were also signs of sexual assault, though Dr. Wooldridge was circumspect in his report, using the medical euphemisms of the era. When he examined Mary at the hospital, he found similar injuries, though less severe. The child had been struck only once, a devastating blow that should have killed her, but by some miracle had not. Mary also showed signs of assault, which Dr. Wooldridge documented with clinical detachment, though his hands trembled as he wrote his notes. The idea that someone could do such things to a child filled him with a cold, helpless rage. He collected what evidence he could. Hair fibers that did not belong to the victims. A few drops of what might have been the killer's blood, perhaps from a scratch Mary had inflicted during her struggle. But forensic science in 1885 was limited. There was no DNA testing, no blood typing, no way to connect these tiny pieces of evidence to a specific individual. The evidence existed, but it told them nothing useful. Based on the temperature of the bodies, the condition of the blood, and the witness testimony from Dr. Johnson, the medical examiner estimated that the attack had occurred between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning. This matched the pattern from the previous attacks. The killer struck in the deepest part of the night, when the city was asleep, when the darkness was most complete. He chose his time carefully. He was patient. He was organized. And that made him all the more dangerous. The police canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something on the night of August 30th. Dr. Lucian Johnson, the neighbor who had discovered the victims, described hearing a single scream, sharp and brief, as if someone had been cut off mid-cry. He had heard no other sounds, no running footsteps, no voices, no struggle. It was over so quickly, he told the police. By the time I reached the servant house, the killer was already gone. Mrs. Valentine Weed, Rebecca's employer, said she had heard nothing at all. Her bedroom was in the main house, separated from the servant house by perhaps 50 feet in a garden. She had slept through the entire attack. When asked if she had noticed any suspicious activity in the days leading up to the murder, she shook her head. No strangers. No one asking about Rebecca. Everything seemed normal. Neighbors on San Marcos Street reported seeing a man walking through the area around 11 o'clock that night, about an hour before the attack. He was described as tall, wearing dark clothing and a hat pulled low over his face. He had been walking with purpose, not loitering or acting suspicious, so no one had thought to stop him or ask his business. When pressed for more details, the witnesses could provide little. It had been dark. The man had kept his distance. He could have been anyone. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Sarah Dixon, said something that caught the attention of the investigators. He walked like someone who belonged here, she said. Not nervous, like he had every right to be on that street. This suggested that the killer was not a stranger to the neighborhood. He knew the area well enough to move through it without course. There was no CCTV in 1885, no surveillance cameras, no video evidence. The city was protected only by the eyes of its citizens and the occasional police patrol. And at midnight on a weeknight, those eyes were mostly closed. The killer had chosen his hunting ground well. As the police compiled their evidence, they began to notice contradictions that troubled them. The boot prints outside the Ramey servant house were large, size 11 or 12, suggesting a man of considerable height and weight. But some of the witnesses who had seen the suspicious man walking through the neighborhood described him as medium build, not particularly large or imposing. Were they talking about the same person? Or had there been multiple men in the area that night? And then there was the question of the weapon. An axe was heavy and unwieldy. It would be difficult to carry through the streets without being noticed. Yet no one had reported seeing a man with an axe. This led some investigators to speculate that the killer might be hiding the weapon somewhere nearby, perhaps in the woods along the river, or in an abandoned building, or even on the property of one of his victims. Searches were conducted, but nothing was found. Another contradiction: the level of violence used in the attacks varied. Molly Smith had been struck multiple times, killed with savage brutality. Eliza Shelley had been killed and assaulted with even more violence. But Irene Cross had been attacked and left alive. Unconscious, but alive. Why had the killer been interrupted? Had he lost his nerve? And in the attack on Rebecca and Mary Ramey, he had killed the adult but only struck the child once before fleeing. This inconsistency suggested either that the killer was disorganized and impulsive, or that he was adapting, learning, changing his methods with each attack. Neither possibility was comforting. In the days following the Ramey murders, the police began to develop a list of suspects. The first and most obvious category was former employees and acquaintances of the victims. Rebecca Ramey had been a widow, but she had male friends, other servants, laborers, men she had known from church. The police interviewed all of them. Most had solid alibis. Those who didn't were brought in for questioning and released when no evidence connected them to the crimes. Molly Smith and Eliza Shelley had also known men, companions, friends, casual acquaintances. The police revisited these individuals, looking for connections between the victims. They found none. The victims had moved in different social circles. They attended different churches. They worked in different neighborhoods. There was no obvious link between them beyond their race, their occupation, and their vulnerability. The second category of suspects was transients and drifters. Austin's population was growing rapidly, and with that growth came an influx of men looking for work, railroad workers, cow laborers, men down on their luck. Many of them camped along the Colorado River or stayed in cheap boarding houses on the east side of town. The police rounded up dozens of these men, questioning them aggressively, sometimes violently. Several were beaten in custody. None of them confessed. None of them had any connection to the victims. But the public wanted someone to blame, and these men, poor, often drunk, always disposable, made convenient scapegoats. The third category was disgruntled former servants or employees. Could the killer be someone who had worked in domestic service himself? Someone who harbored resentment against the white families who employed black servants, or against the servants themselves? This theory led nowhere. The police could find no one who fit the profile. In early September, the police arrested a man named Nathan Elgin, a black laborer who had been seen arguing with Eliza Shelley weeks before her death. The argument had been about money. Eliza had lent Nathan a small sum, and he had not paid her back. They had exchanged harsh words in front of witnesses. Nathan was arrested and held for questioning. The newspapers ran headlines: "Suspect arrested in servant girl murders." The city breathed a sigh of relief. The monster had been caught. But Nathan Elgin had an airtight alibi. On the night of Eliza's murder, he had been in jail, arrested for public drunkenness and held overnight. The police records confirmed it. He could not possibly have killed her. And on the nights of the other murders, he had been at work, surrounded by witnesses. He was released after 3 days in custody, but the damage was done. His name was now associated with the murders. He lost his job. He left Austin shortly thereafter, driven out by suspicion and rumor. He was the first red herring, but not the last, building the real suspect. While the police chased false leads, the real killer continued to move freely through the city. And he was watching. He was learning. He knew which neighborhoods the police were patrolling. He knew which streets were well lit and which were shrouded in darkness. He knew the rhythms of the city, when people went to bed, when they woke, when the servants were most vulnerable. He was careful, patient, methodical, and he was not done. On the night of September 28, 1885, less than a month after the Ramey murders, the killer struck again. The victim was Gracie Vance, a 25-year-old black woman who worked as a laundress for the Barton family on West 11th Street. Gracie was quiet and shy, known for keeping to herself. She had no family in Austin. She had come from Louisiana 3 years earlier, following a cousin who had since moved on to Dallas. She lived alone in a small servant house, washing clothes by hand in a big iron tub, her fingers raw from lye soap and hot water. On the evening of September 28th, Gracie finished her work just after sunset. She ate a small supper, leftover cornbread and greens, and then went to bed early, exhausted from a long day of labor. She did not lock her door. She did not have a lock. She did not. Around midnight, the killer entered her servant house. This time, there was a witness, or at least, someone who came close to being one. Young Thomas Barton, the 11-year-old son of Gracie's employer, had been unable to sleep that night. The heat was oppressive, and he had been tossing and turning in his bed on the second floor of the main house. He got up to get a drink of water from the kitchen. As he passed by the window, he looked out into the backyard. He saw a figure moving near the servant house. At first, he thought it was Gracie, perhaps taking the air or visiting the outhouse. But then he realized the figure was too tall, too broad-shouldered. It was a man. Thomas watched as the man approached the servant house door, paused for a moment as if listening, and then opened it and stepped inside. The boy felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the way the man moved, slow, deliberate, predatory, frightened him. He wanted to call out, to wake his parents, to raise an alarm. But he was a child, and he was afraid. What if the man heard him? What if the man came for him next? So Thomas stood at the window, frozen, watching. A few minutes later, he heard a sound, a muffled thump, like something heavy hitting wood. Then silence. The man emerged from the servant house, closed the door behind him, and walked away through the yard, disappearing into the darkness beyond the fence. Thomas ran to his parents' room and shook his father awake.
"Papa, there's a man! He went into Gracie's house!"
Mr. Barton, groggy and confused, told his son he had been dreaming and should go back to bed, but Thomas insisted. "Papa, I saw him. Please, you have to check on Gracie." Reluctantly, Mr. Barton pulled on his boots and took a lantern. He walked out to the servant house, expecting to find nothing, expecting to prove to his son that it had been a dream or a shadow or an overactive imagination. He knocked on the door. "Gracie, you all right?" No answer. He opened the door. Gracie Vance was lying on her bed, unconscious, blood pouring from a wound in her head. She was still alive, barely. Mr. Barton ran for the doctor, screaming for help as he went. Gracie Vance survived the attack, though like the others before her, she was left with permanent injuries. The blow to her head had fractured her skull and caused bleeding in her brain. She spent weeks in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, plagued by seizures and fevers. When she finally woke, she could remember very little. She remembered going to sleep. She remembered a sound, maybe the door opening, maybe footsteps, and then nothing. The doctor said she was lucky to be alive. The blow had been slightly off-center, missing the most vulnerable part of her skull by less than an inch. But Gracie did not feel lucky. She could no longer work. The headaches were too severe, the memory problems too debilitating. She could not stand for long periods. She could not lift heavy objects. She had to leave Austin, returning to Louisiana to live with distant relatives who barely knew her and resented the burden she represented. The killer had not taken her life, but he had destroyed it all the same. Young Thomas Barton was the first witness to actually see the killer. The police questioned him extensively. What did the man look like? Thomas tried his best to remember. It had been dark. The man had been moving, but he offered what details he could. Tall, taller than his father, who was about 5 feet 10 inches. Broad-shouldered, but not fat. Muscular, perhaps, or at least strong. Wearing dark clothing, a dark shirt, dark pants, a hat pulled low. The hat was the most distinctive feature Thomas remembered. It had a wide brim, the kind that cowboys or laborers wore to keep the sun off their faces. The man had moved confidently, without hesitation. He had not stumbled or looked around nervously. He had walked straight to the servant house as if he knew exactly where he was going. "Did you see his face?" the police asked. Thomas shook his head. "It was too dark, and he was facing away from me most of the time." "Could you recognize him if you saw him again?" Thomas thought about it. "I don't know. Maybe if I saw the way he walked." It was not much, but it was more than they had before. The police now knew that the killer was a tall man, strong, confident, and familiar enough with the city to navigate it in total darkness. But that description could fit hundreds of men in Austin. By October 1885, Austin was a city gripped by terror. 5 attacks, 3 deaths, 2 survivors with shattered lives and broken memories. 1 child witness who had seen the killer but could not identify him. The newspapers were relentless in their coverage. Every day brought new headlines, new theories, new speculation.
"The fiend's still at large."
"Police helpless against midnight murderer. Will no one stop this monster?" The Austin Daily Statesman published editorials demanding action. Citizens wrote angry letters. Public meetings were held at churches and town halls, where frightened residents demanded that the authorities do something, anything to stop the killing. Chief Lucy was under enormous pressure. The mayor threatened to replace him if he could not solve the case. The city council allocated additional funds for more officers, more patrols, more investigations. But money and manpower were not enough. The killer was too careful, too clever, too invisible. As fear turned to anger, vigilante groups began to form. White citizens organized patrols, arming themselves with shotguns and pistols, walking the streets at night in groups of 3 or 4. They stopped anyone who looked suspicious, which in practice meant any black man who was outside after dark without a clear reason for being there. Dozens of innocent men were detained, questioned, searched, and sometimes beaten by these amateur lawmen who believed they were protecting their city. The black community protested. Church leaders met with the mayor, demanding protection from both the killer and the vigilantes. "Our people are being terrorized twice over," said Reverend Jacob Fontaine of the First Baptist Church for Colored, "once by the murderer who stalks our daughters and sisters, and again by the white mobs who assume every black man is guilty until proven innocent." The mayor promised to rein in the vigilantes, but his promises were hollow. The police were overwhelmed, and they had no means of controlling armed citizens who claimed to be acting in the public interest. The city was fracturing along racial lines, divided by fear and suspicion and the old, ugly prejudices that had never really healed after the Civil War. The theory of multiple killers in mid-October. A new theory began to circulate among the police and in the newspapers. What if there was more than one killer? What if this was not the work of a single madman, but rather a group, a gang of criminals who were targeting servant women for reasons unknown? The theory had some merit. The attacks had occurred in different parts of the city, sometimes within days of each other. Could one man really move so freely, so frequently, without being caught? Detective William Wooldridge, the younger brother of the medical examiner, became a proponent of this theory. "Look at the evidence," he argued at a police meeting. "The boot prints from the Ramey scene are larger than the prints from the Shelley scene. The weapon strikes vary in force and angle. Some victims are killed quickly. Others are tortured. This suggests different perpetrators with different levels of strength and different psychological profiles." Chief Lucy listened, but he was not convinced. "It's the same pattern," he countered. "Always servant women. Always at night. Always in their homes. Always with an axe or similar weapon. That's not a coincidence." The debate continued, but it led nowhere. Without concrete evidence, both theories remained pure speculation. On October 15, 1885, the police arrested 2 men. Tom Majors and Dick Majors, brothers who worked as laborers in Austin. The Majors brothers were black men in their late 20s. They were known to drink heavily and to get into fights. They had both been fired from various jobs for unreliability and bad temper. A witness had come forward claiming to have seen Dick Majors near the Barton property on the night Gracie Vance was attacked. The police brought them in for questioning. The interrogation was brutal. Both men were beaten. They were denied food and water. They were kept in separate cells and told that the other had already confessed. Tom Majors broke first. He admitted to being eerie on the night of one of the murders, though he claimed he had been drunk and could not remember exactly where he had been or what he had done. Dick Majors maintained his innocence, insisting that he had been home asleep on the night in question and that his mother could vouch for him. The newspapers reported the arrests with triumph. "Murderers captured, brothers confess!" But the evidence against them was flimsy at best. Tom's confession was vague and contradictory. He could not describe any details of the crime scene. He could not explain how he had committed the murders. His statement read more like a desperate attempt to stop the beatings than a genuine admission of guilt. Dick's alibi was verified by his mother and 2 neighbors who confirmed that he had been at home on the nights in question. The boot prints did not match their shoes. Wooldridge examined Tom and Dick and concluded that neither man had the physical strength to inflict the kind of devastating hits that had killed the victims. After 2 weeks in custody, the Majors brothers were released. No charges were filed. They left Austin immediately, fearing for their lives. They were innocent men whose names had been dragged through the mud by a desperate police force and a bloodthirsty public. They were not the last. On the night of October 30th, 1885, the killer made a dramatic shift. For the first time, he attacked white victims. The targets were Mary Hancock, a 28-year-old white woman, and her wealthy employer's wife, Mrs. Eula Phillips. The attack occurred on East Water Street, in a neighborhood that had previously felt safe from the terror, because it was predominantly white and relatively affluent. Mary Hancock was not a servant in the traditional sense. She was what was called a companion, a young woman employed to keep an older woman company, to help with light housework, and to provide social interaction. She lived in the main house with the Phillips family, not in a separate outbuilding. Mrs. Eula Phillips was 42 years old, the wife of a prominent banker. She was known for her charitable work, her elegance, and her sharp intelligence. On the night of October 30th, Mr. Phillips was away on business in Houston. The household consisted of Mrs. Phillips, Mary Hancock, and two young children who were asleep upstairs. Around midnight, someone broke into the Phillips house. The intruder moved through the first floor with apparent familiarity, navigating the rooms in darkness without knocking over furniture or making noise. He entered the bedroom where Mrs. Phillips and Mary Hancock were sleeping. Mrs. Phillips woke to the sound of breathing. Heavy, deliberate close. She opened her eyes and saw a shape standing at the foot of her bed. Before she could scream, the intruder lunged forward. The killer struck Mrs. Phillips across the head with his weapon, again an axe or something similar. The blow was powerful but not perfectly aimed. It struck her on the shoulder and glanced off her skull, cutting deep but not fracturing bone. Mrs. Phillips screamed a loud, sustained scream that echoed through the house and out into the street. The killer struck again, this time hitting her arm as she raised it to defend herself. The blade cut through flesh and muscle, nearly severing her hand at the wrist. Blood sprayed across the bed, across the walls, across the floor. Mary Hancock woke and began screaming as well. The killer turned toward her. Mary scrambled out of bed, trying to run for the door. The killer caught her before she could reach it. He struck her once, across the back of the head. She fell to the floor, unconscious, blood pouring from the wound. Then the killer did something he had not done before, or at least, had not been witnessed doing before. He dragged Mary's unconscious body toward the window. Mrs. Phillips, bleeding and in agony, watched in horror as the intruder lifted Mary and began to push her through the open window, clearly intending to take her outside, to take her away. Phillips's screams had awakened the neighbors. Lights were coming on in the houses nearby. Voices were shouting. Someone was running toward the Phillips house. The killer heard them coming. He dropped Mary, letting her body fall half in, half out of the window, and fled. He ran out of the bedroom, down the hallway, and out through the back door of the house. By the time the neighbors arrived, he was gone. Both women survived, though both were gravely injured. Mrs. Phillips's hand was nearly severed. The doctors managed to save it, but she would never regain full use of it. The scar across her shoulder was deep and disfiguring. She would carry it for the rest of her life. Mary Hancock's skull had been fractured. She spent weeks in a coma, her life hanging by a thread. When she finally woke, she had no memory of the attack. She could not describe the intruder. She could not say why she had been targeted, but the city was in shock. The killer had crossed the racial barrier. He had entered a wealthy white home and attacked white women. This changed everything. When the news of the Phillips attack reached the public, the reaction was immediate and explosive. White citizens who had been only moderately concerned when the victims were black servants were now terrified. If the killer could attack Mrs. Phillips, a wealthy, respectable white woman in her own home, then no one was safe. The newspapers published frantic editorials. "The fiend has invaded our homes. Our wives and daughters are in mortal danger." Public meetings were held. Demands were made for martial law, for a curfew, for the deployment of the state militia. The governor of Texas, John Ireland, issued a statement promising that every resource of the state would be devoted to capturing the killer. A reward was announced, the $500 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the murderer. A massive sum in 1885, equivalent to more than a year's salary for most workers. Tips poured in. The police were overwhelmed with reports of suspicious activity, strange men, and unusual behavior. But none of it led anywhere. The killer had vanished once again into the darkness. The attack on the Phillips house caused the police to reconsider their theories. If the killer had been targeting black servant women for racial or sexual reasons, why had he suddenly attacked white women? Detective Cheneville proposed a new theory as escalating. The servant women were practice. He was building up his confidence, his skill. Now he's ready to go after bigger targets, women who are harder to reach, who have more protection. Chief Lucy nodded slowly, which means he's not going to stop. He's going to keep escalating until we catch him, or until he makes a mistake, or until he kills someone who can fight back, Cheneville added grimly. But even as they spoke, the killer was already planning his next move. On the night of November 7, 1885, the killer returned to his original pattern. The victim was Orange Washington, a 17-year-old black girl who worked as a servant for the Watkins family on West Cedar Street. Orange was young, shy, and deeply religious. She had only been in Austin for 6 months, having come from a small town outside of San Antonio to find work and send money back to her family. She was saving money to bring her younger sister to Austin. She talked about it constantly, how they would rent a small room together, how they would both find work, how they would build a better life. On the night of November 7th, Orange went to bed in the small servant house behind the Watkins property. She said her prayers as she did every night, and fell asleep with a Bible on the table beside her bed. Sometime after midnight, the killer entered her servant house. There were no witnesses this time. No one heard anything. No one saw anything. The next morning, when Orange did not appear to start breakfast, Mrs. Watkins sent her son to fetch her. He found Orange Washington lying on the floor of the servant house, her head crushed, her body violated, her blood soaked into the rough wooden planks. She was dead. The police arrived and documented the scene with grim efficiency. They had done this too many times now. They knew what to look for. The weapon had been an axe. The blows had been powerful, delivered from above, striking Orange while she was still in bed or just rising from it. There were signs of a struggle. Orange had defensive wounds on her hands and arms. She had fought back even though she was small and he was much stronger. The killer had assaulted her. Wooldridge confirmed it in his examination. And then he had left her body on the floor and walked away. Nothing had been stolen. The door had not been forced. The killer had simply walked in, committed his atrocity, and walked out. The servant house smelled of blood and fear and something else. Something sharp and chemical that might have been the killer's sweat or the kerosene he used in his lamp. Orange's Bible lay on the table, open to the book of Psalms. The page was marked at Psalm 23. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The irony was not lost on the investigators. Orange Washington had feared no evil. She had trusted in God to protect her. She had believed that if she lived a good life, if she worked hard and helped her family and kept her faith, then she would be safe. But evil had come for her anyway. It had crept into her small room in the darkness, and it had destroyed her, and her faith had not saved her. Her body was taken to the city morgue. Her family was notified by telegram. Her younger sister, who had been waiting for Orange to send for her, never came to Austin. The money Orange had saved was sent back to her family to pay for her funeral. She was buried in the colored section of Oakwood, in an unmarked grave. She was 17 years old. By mid-November 1885, the police had accumulated a substantial amount of evidence from 8 different crime scenes. They had plaster casts of boot prints. They had fabric samples. They had hair and fiber evidence. They had witness descriptions of a tall man in dark clothing. They had Thomas Barton's testimony about the man's confident walk and wide-brimmed hat. They had Dr. Hat Wooldridge's detailed medical reports documenting the nature and severity of the injuries. But none of it fit together into a coherent picture of a single suspect. The boot prints varied in size. The fabric samples were too common to be useful. The hair and fiber evidence could not be connected to any individual without modern forensic techniques that did not yet exist. The witness descriptions were maddeningly vague: tall, dark clothing, wide-brimmed hat. That described half the working men in Austin. Chief Lucy was exhausted. He had not slept more than a few hours a night in weeks. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His hands shook when he tried to write reports. He was a proud man, a competent lawman, and he was failing. 8 attacks, 4 deaths. 4 survivors whose lives had been destroyed, and he was no closer to catching the killer than he had been on the morning they found Molly Smith's body. He called a meeting with his senior officers. "We're missing something," he said. "There has to be a pattern we're not seeing. A connection we're overlooking." Detective Wooldridge spread out a map of Austin on the table. He marked each attack site with a pin. They studied the map in silence. The attacks were scattered across the city. There was no clear geographic pattern. Some were in the wealthy neighborhoods north of the river. Some were in the working-class areas to the east and west. There was no center point, no obvious hunting ground. "He moves," Friedeville said. "He knows the city well. He's not a stranger or a drifter. He's someone who lives here. Or someone who works here," Wooldridge added. "Someone whose job gives him a reason to be in different neighborhoods. A deliveryman, a peddler, a laborer." Lucy nodded. "We need to interview everyone who fits that description. Start with men who have been in the neighborhoods where the attacks occurred." It was a massive undertaking. There were thousands of men in Austin who could fit that profile, but they had no other leads. Over the next 2 weeks, the police interrogated hundreds of men. Deliverymen who brought ice and milk and groceries. Peddlers who sold pots and pans door to door. Laborers who moved from job to job across the city. Railroad workers, stablemen, blacksmiths, carpenters. Anyone who had a reason to be mobile, to know the city streets and alleyways. Most of the interrogations were brief and unproductive. The men had alibis. They had steady work. They had families who vouched for them. But some did not. Some men were suspicious, evasive, nervous. Some had criminal records. Some had histories of violence toward women. Several were arrested and held for further questioning. None of them were the killer. The police were chasing shadows. Joseph Wooldridge, the medical examiner, had been studying the case from a scientific perspective. He was familiar with the emerging field of criminal psychology, the idea that a killer's behavior could reveal aspects of his personality, his motives, his identity. He wrote a report summarizing his observations, which he presented to Chief Lucy. Profile of the Austin killer. Male, age 25-40. The physical strength required to inflict the injuries suggests a man in his prime, not a youth or an elderly person. Physically strong and fit. The ability to swing an axe with lethal force repeatedly indicates significant upper body strength. Familiar with Austin and its neighborhoods. The killer moves through the city with confidence, navigating in darkness, knowing which houses have servants, which doors are unlocked, patient and methodical. He does not attack impulsively. He watches, he plans, he waits for the right moment. Sexually motivated. The pattern of sexual assault suggests that the violence is not purely about killing. It is about power, control, and sexual gratification, escalating. The attacks have become more frequent and more brazen over time. He is growing bolder, more confident, more dangerous. Socially functional. He does not stand out as obviously insane or dangerous. He is able to blend in, to appear normal, to avoid suspicion in daily life. Chief Lucy read the report carefully. "So we're looking for a strong, intelligent man who appears normal and lives among us without raising suspicion," he said bitterly. "That narrows it down to about 5,000 people." Dr. Wooldridge nodded. "I know it's not much help, but it does tell us one important thing. This man is not a raving lunatic. He's not foaming at the mouth and talking to himself. He's someone's neighbor, someone's coworker, maybe someone's husband or brother. Which means he could be anyone," Lucy said. "Exactly." The streets of Austin were decorated with wreaths and candles. Churches prepared for midnight services. Families gathered for suppers of roast turkey and sweet potatoes and pecan pie. Children whispered excitedly about what gifts they might find in the morning. But the killer had other plans. On the night of December 24, 1885, he would commit his most horrific act yet, an attack so brutal, so shocking, that it would become known as the Christmas Eve Massacre. This time, he would kill 2 women in a single night, and this time both victims would be white. The first victim of Christmas Eve was Susan Sue Hancock, a 24-year-old white woman who lived with her husband Moses Hancock in a modest home on East Cypress Street. Sue was pregnant 7 months along with her first child. She and Moses had been married for just over a year. They were a young couple deeply in love, struggling financially but happy. looking forward to the baby that would make their family complete. Moses worked as a clerk in a hardware store downtown. Sue took in sewing to earn extra money. She was known for her skill with a needle, her cheerful disposition, and her kindness to neighbors. On Christmas Eve, Moses had worked late at the store, helping with last-minute customers buying gifts and supplies for their holiday celebrations. He returned home around 10 o'clock, tired but in good spirits. Sue had prepared a simple supper. They ate together by lamplight, talking about the baby, about names they were considering, about the future they were building. Around 11 o'clock they went to bed. Moses fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from his long day. Sue lay awake for a while, feeling the baby move inside her, thinking about the strange and wonderful fact that in just 2 months, she would be a mother. She eventually drifted off to sleep, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Sometime after midnight, the killer entered their home. The killer moved through the Hancock house with the same quiet confidence he had shown in his previous attacks. He navigated the dark rooms without stumbling. He knew where he was going. He entered the bedroom where Moses and Sue slept. He approached Sue's side of the bed, and he struck. The axe came down on Sue's head with devastating force. The blow fractured her skull instantly. Blood sprayed across the pillow, across the sheets, across Moses, who was sleeping beside her. Moses woke to the sound of the impact, a wet, terrible cracking sound that he would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. He opened his eyes and saw a shape standing over his wife. A tall figure, silhouetted against the faint moonlight coming through the window. Moses tried to move, tried to shout, tried to protect his wife. But before he could react, the killer struck him too. The axe blade caught Moses across the side of his head, cutting deep into his scalp and temple. He felt an explosion of pain, a rush of warmth as blood poured down his face. He fell back onto the bed, his vision swimming, his thoughts fragmenting. The killer struck Sue again and again and again. He was in a frenzy now, bringing the axe down repeatedly, long past the point when Sue was already dead. Moses, bleeding and barely conscious, tried to reach for his wife. He tried to pull her away from the killer. He tried to do something, anything, but his body wouldn't respond. His limbs felt heavy, distant, disconnected. He heard the killer's breathing, harsh and labored, as if the violence had been physically exhausting. And then, through his fading consciousness, Moses heard something that would haunt him forever. The killer spoke. It was just a single word muttered under his breath, too quiet for Moses to make out clearly. But it was a human voice, not a demon, not a monster, a man. And then the killer left. He walked out of the bedroom, out of the house, and disappeared into the Christmas Eve darkness. Moses Hancock survived, though he wished he hadn't. Neighbors found him the next morning, Christmas Day, lying in bed beside his wife's mutilated body, covered in blood, barely alive. Sue Hancock was dead, so was her unborn child. Moses spent weeks in the hospital recovering from his physical wounds. The blow to his head had fractured his skull and caused permanent damage to his vision and hearing. He would never work as a clerk again. The fine detail work, the reading, the careful accounting, all of it was beyond him now. But worse than the physical injuries were the emotional and psychological wounds. Moses had failed to protect his wife. He had been lying right beside her when she was murdered, and he had been unable to stop it. The guilt consumed him. He gave a statement to the police, describing what he remembered: the tall figure, the axe, the frenzied attack, the single word the killer had spoken. But he could not identify the killer. He had not seen his face. He could not say who the man was or why he had targeted them. Moses left Austin after he recovered. He could not bear to stay in the city where his wife and child had been murdered. He moved to San Antonio, changed his name, and tried to disappear into anonymity. He never remarried. He died in 1903, at the age of 42, from complications of alcoholism. The Christmas Eve attack him as surely as it had killed his wife, but the killer was not finished. On the same night, Christmas Eve 1885, he struck again. His second target was Mrs. Eula Phillips, the same woman he had attacked 2 months earlier on October 30. Eula had survived the first attack, though she still bore the scars, both physical and psychological. Her hand had healed imperfectly, leaving her with limited mobility in her fingers. The wound across her shoulder ached in cold weather, and the nightmares came every time she closed her eyes. After the October attack, her husband had taken extra precautions. He had installed locks on all the doors and windows. He had purchased a revolver and kept it on his bedside table. He had hired a night watchman to patrol the property. But on Christmas Eve, Mr. Phillips was once again away on business, this time in Dallas, settling affairs related to his bank. Eula was home with Mary Hancock, the 2 children, and the night watchman. The night watchman, a young man named James Murphy, was supposed to patrol the grounds every hour, checking the doors and windows, watching for intruders. James Murphy made a fatal mistake. Around 11 o'clock, he stepped away from the property to visit a nearby saloon. He told himself he would only be gone for 20 minutes, just long enough to have a quick drink to ward off the cold and the boredom of his solitary vigil. He was gone for an hour, and in that hour, the killer struck. The killer entered the Phillips house through a window that James Murphy had failed to check before leaving. He moved through the house in darkness, navigating the rooms with familiarity. He had been here before. He knew where Eula slept. He entered her bedroom. Eula woke to the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, unmistakable. She knew immediately what was happening. She reached for the revolver on her bedside table. But the killer was faster. He struck her before she could raise the gun, hitting her across the arm with his axe. The blade cut through muscle and bone, and the revolver fell from her hand, clattering to the floor. Eula screamed, a long, sustained scream that echoed through the house. Mary Hancock woke in the next room and began screaming as well. The children woke upstairs, crying in terror. The killer struck Eula again, this time across the head. The blow was not as precise as his others, perhaps because she was struggling, perhaps because he was rushed away that the screams would bring people running. But it was enough. Eula fell to the floor, blood pouring from wounds to her head and arm. The killer heard voices outside, neighbors responding to the screams. He abandoned Eula and ran to the next room, where Mary Hancock was cowering in the corner. He struck Mary once across the shoulder, knocking her to the ground. And then he heard the front door opening. James Murphy had returned from the saloon, drawn by the screams. The killer ran. He went out through the same window he had entered, dropping into the yard and disappearing in the darkness, before anyone could get a clear look at him. Both women survived, though both were gravely injured. Eula Phillips had been attacked twice now by the same killer. The psychological trauma was almost unbearable. She developed severe anxiety, unable to sleep, unable to be alone, jumping at every sound. She and her husband left Austin within weeks of the second attack, moving to Houston where they hoped to start fresh, to escape the memories. But the memories followed her. Eula never fully recovered. She spent the rest of her life in fear, always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for the killer to return. Mary Hancock also survived, but like Eula, she was permanently scarred by the experience. She left domestic service and moved to San Antonio to live with relatives. James Murphy, the night watchman who had abandoned his post, was fired immediately. He was also charged with negligence, though the charges were eventually dropped. He left Austin in disgrace, his reputation destroyed. The Christmas Eve attacks shocked the city in a way that even the previous murders had not. 2 attacks in a single night, white victims in their own homes. A pregnant woman and her unborn child murdered. A woman attacked for the second time, as if the killer was taunting the police, demonstrating his invincibility. The newspapers published frantic, desperate headlines. CS Mivi Terror.
HV Tracus Ajay Marampin.
Mama Marjoral.
The day after Christmas in Orchard in Chaos, public meetings were held at churches, town halls, and street corners. Angry citizens demanded action. Some called for martial law. Others demanded that Chief Lucy be fired and replaced with someone more competent. The mayor, John Robertson, held an emergency meeting with the city council. The pressure was enormous. The city's reputation was in ruins. Families were fleeing Austin, afraid for their lives. Businesses were suffering as fear kept people indoors after dark. Something had to be done. The city council voted to bring in outside help. They sent telegrams to police departments in other cities, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, asking for detectives to assist with the investigation. They also sent a telegram to the famous Pinkerton National Detective Agency, requesting that they send their best investigators to Austin to hunt the killer. In early January 1886, two Pinkerton detectives arrived in Austin: Thomas Muldoon and James Bryce. Muldoon was a veteran investigator, a former Chicago police officer who had worked dozens of murder cases. Bryce was younger, but he had a reputation for meticulous forensic work and innovative investigative techniques. They met with Chief Lucy and reviewed all the evidence, all the witness statements, all the theories that had been developed over the previous year. Muldoon's assessment was blunt. You've been chasing your tail. You've arrested dozens of innocent men. You've followed every false lead. You've let the real killer slip through your fingers again and again. Lucy bristled at the criticism, but he could not deny it. What would you do differently? He asked. Muldoon spread out the map of Austin, studying the locations of the attacks. First, we need to understand the pattern, not just where he attacks, but when and why. He's choosing victims deliberately. There's a logic to it, even if we can't see it yet. Bryce added, we also need to look at who benefits from these attacks. Not financially, we know robbery isn't a motive, but psychologically. Who gets satisfaction from this kind of violence? A madman, Chief Lucy said. Maybe, Muldoon replied, but even madmen have patterns. Even chaos has structure if you know how to look for it. The Pinkerton detectives brought new energy and new methods to the investigation. They re-interviewed all the survivors, asking questions the local police had not thought to ask. They examined the crime scenes again, looking for evidence that might have been overlooked. They created detailed timelines of each attack, looking for connections, for overlaps, for moments when the killer might have made a mistake. And they began to develop a new theory, one that would ultimately lead to a suspect. Detective Bryce noticed something that everyone else had missed. Most of the victims, both black and white, had one thing in common. They had recently hired new servants or had servants who had recently left their employment. Molly Smith had worked for the Hall family, who had recently hired a new stableman. Eliza Shelley had worked for the Dunham family, who had recently dismissed a gardener for drunkenness. The Ramey family had worked for the Weed family, who employed several male servants and laborers. The Phillips family had hired a new coachman just weeks before the first attack. What if the killer is targeting households where he has access? Bryce proposed. What if he's a servant himself, or a laborer, someone who works for these families or knows people who do? Muldoon nodded slowly. That would explain how he knows which houses have servant quarters, how he knows which doors are unlocked, how he can move through neighborhoods without attracting suspicion, because he belongs there. They began to compile a list of every male servant, laborer, coachman, gardener, and stableman who had worked for any of the victim families in the months leading up to the attacks. It was a long list, more than 200 names, but it was a place to start. One name appeared on the list more than once. Maurice, a black man in his mid-30s who worked as a cook and general laborer. Maurice had worked for the Hall family briefly in the fall of 1884. He had also done odd jobs for the Dunham family in early 1885, and he had been seen in the neighborhood near the Phillips house on multiple occasions. The detectives brought Maurice in for questioning. Maurice was a large man, over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with powerful arms developed from years of manual labor. He fit the physical description given by Thomas Barton and other witnesses. But Maurice had seemed like an unlikely suspect to the local police. He was well known in the community. He attended church regularly. He had a wife and 2 children. He had no criminal record. Still, the Pinkerton detectives pressed him. Where were you on the night of December 30th, 1884? Muldoon asked. I don't remember, Maurice said. That was over a year ago. Where were you on the night of May 6th, 1885? I don't know. Working, or at home. Can anyone verify that? Maurice hesitated. Wife, maybe. But we don't keep track of every night. I work when there's work. I come home when I'm done. Do you know Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Rebecca Ramey? I might have seen them around. I don't know their names. You worked for the families that employed them. I worked for a lot of families. That don't mean I knew their servants. The questioning went on for hours. Maurice remained calm, cooperative, but unable to provide solid alibis for any of the nights in question. The detectives searched his home. They found nothing incriminating, no bloodstained clothing, no axe, no evidence connecting him to the crimes. But they found something else. In Maurice's shed behind his house, they found a wide, brimmed hat similar to the one Thomas Barton had described, and they found a pair of boots with a herringbone pattern on the soles. The boots were sent to be compared with the plaster cast taken from the crime scenes. The comparison was inconclusive. The herringbone pattern matched, but thousands of boots had that pattern. The size was close but not exact. Still, it was more evidence than they had against anyone else. The detectives also learned that Maurice had a history they had not known about. In 1881, before he came to Austin, Maurice had been arrested in Houston for assaulting a woman. The charges had been dropped when the woman refused to testify, but the arrest was on record. This revelation changed everything. Maurice was no longer just a person of interest. He was a legitimate suspect. News of Maurice's arrest spread through Austin like wildfire. The white community reacted with relief and vindication. We knew it was one of them, some said, giving voice to the ugly racial prejudice that had always simmered beneath the surface. The black community reacted with anger and fear. Maurice was a respected member of the community. He had a family. He attended church. Many people believed he was being scapegoated, arrested because the police needed someone to blame, not because he was actually guilty. Reverend Jacob Fontaine organized a defense fund, collecting money to hire a lawyer for Maurice. "This man is innocent," Fontaine declared from his pulpit. "He is being persecuted because of the color of his skin, just as so many of our brothers have been persecuted before him." But the Pinkerton detectives were convinced they had their man. "All the evidence points to Maurice," Muldoon told Chief Lucy. "He had access to the victims. He fits the physical description. He has a history of violence against women, and he has no alibi for any of the nights in question." "But you have no proof," Lucy said. "No witness who can positively identify him, no weapon, no confession. A jury will never convict him based on what we have." "Then we need to get more," Muldoon said. "We need to make him confess." Maurice was held in custody for 3 weeks. During that time, he was interrogated repeatedly, sometimes for 12 hours at a stretch. The methods used were harsh, though not as brutal as those used on some previous suspects. Maurice was denied sleep. He was kept in isolation. He was told that witnesses had identified him, that his wife had turned against him, that he would hang unless he confessed. But Maurice never confessed. He maintained his innocence throughout. "I didn't kill nobody," he said over and over. "I got a family. I got a why do these things?" "Because you're sick," Muldoon said. "Because you can't control yourself. Because you have urges that normal men don't have." "That ain't true," Maurice said. "I'm not that kind of man." The detectives brought in the survivors, Mary Ramey, Irene Cross, Moses Hancock, and asked them to look at Maurice to see if they recognized him. None of them could say with certainty that Maurice was the man who had attacked them. "I can't see his face in my memory," Mary Ramey said. "It was too dark. I was too scared. I don't know if it was him or not." After 3 weeks, the district attorney reviewed the evidence and made a decision. There was not enough to charge Maurice with murder. The boots were not a definitive match. The hat was too common. The prior arrest in Houston was too old and too vague to be admissible in court. And without a confession or a positive identification from a survivor, there was no case. Maurice was released. He walked out of the jail on a cold January afternoon, thin and exhausted, his reputation destroyed, his life in ruins. Within days, he and his family left Austin. They moved to Chicago, hoping to start over in a city where no one knew their name or their story. Maurice died in 1899 at the age of 48 from tuberculosis. He never spoke publicly about his arrest or the accusations against him. To the end of his life, his family maintained that he was innocent. With Maurice released and no other strong suspects, the investigation stalled once again. The Pinkerton detectives remained in Austin for another month, following up on leads, interviewing witnesses, searching for evidence. But they found nothing. In February 1886, they returned to Chicago, their mission a failure. Chief Lucy was devastated. He had been so certain that Maurice was the killer. The evidence had seemed to point to him. And yet, in the end, there had not been enough to convict him. Maybe he was innocent, Detective Cheneville said quietly. Lucy shook his head. Or maybe he was guilty, and we just couldn't prove it. Or maybe, Cheneville said, the real killer is still out there. The attacks stopped, and then, as suddenly as they had begun, the attacks stopped. There were no more murders in Austin after Christmas Eve 1885. January passed, February, March. The city held its breath, waiting for the killer to strike again. But he never did. By summer, people began to cautiously hope that the nightmare was over. Perhaps the killer had died. Perhaps he had left the city. Perhaps he had been frightened by the intense police activity and the Pinkerton investigation. Or perhaps he had simply decided to stop. No one knew. The case remained open, but active investigation gradually ceased. The police had other crimes to solve, other emergencies to address. The servant girl murders became history, a dark chapter in Austin's past that people preferred not to talk about. But the survivors never forgot Mary Ramey, who had been 11 years old when the killer tried to murder her, and succeeded in killing her mother, lived the rest of her life with the scars, both physical and emotional. She moved to California in the 1890s, married children of her own. But she never returned to Austin. She never spoke publicly about what had happened to her. She died in 1954 at the age of 80. Taking her memories of that terrible night to the grave, Moses Hancock, who had lost his pregnant wife on Christmas Eve, never recovered. He drank himself to death within 20 years, a broken man haunted by guilt and grief. Eula Phillips, attacked twice and scarred forever, lived in fear for the rest of her life. She died in 1912, still checking the locks on her doors every night, still sleeping with a loaded gun beside her bed. The killer had destroyed so many lives, and he had never been caught. The Austin servant girl murders might remain a footnote in Texas history, a tragic but localized series of crimes, had it not been for what happened 3 years later, thousands of miles away. In the autumn of 1888, London was gripped by terror. A serial killer was stalking the impoverished Whitechapel district, murdering prostitutes with shocking brutality. The killer taunted the police with letters. He called himself Jack the Ripper. The Ripper murders became a global sensation, reported in newspapers around the world. And, as the details emerged, the brutal mutilations, the targeting of vulnerable women, the killer who struck without warning and vanished without a trace, some people began to notice unsettling similarities. The Austin murders had occurred in 1884 and 1885. The Whitechapel murders began in 1888, 3 years apart, an ocean apart, but eerily similar in their methodology, their mystery. In Abrutine 9, a Texas newspaper, the San Antonio Light, published an article suggesting a connection between the Austin murders and the Whitechapel murders. The article was written by a crime reporter named James Devine, who had followed the Austin case closely when it was happening. Devine's theory was simple but shocking. What if the Austin servant girl annihilator and Jack the Ripper were the same person? He laid out his evidence. Both killers used bladed weapons, axes in Austin, knives in London, to inflict massive trauma to their victims. Both attacked in the dead of night, when their victims were most vulnerable. Both targeted women who were socially marginalized and had limited protection, servants in Austin, prostitutes in London. Both killers did not simply murder their victims, they mutilated them, inflicting injuries far beyond what was necessary to cause death. The Austin killer had crushed skulls and committed sexual assaults. Jack the Ripper had disemboweled his victims and removed organs. Both showed signs of a sadistic personality that derived pleasure from violence and suffering. Wooldridge's reports from the Austin murders noted that some of the axe blows had been delivered with remarkable precision, striking vital areas with what seemed like anatomical knowledge. The Ripper murders were even more notable for this. Several doctors who examined the Whitechapel victims suggested that the killer had medical or surgical training, based on the way organs had been removed. The Austin murders had stopped abruptly in December 1885 with no explanation. The Whitechapel murders also stopped abruptly in November 1888. In both cases, the killer simply vanished, as if he had never existed. Devine noted that there was exactly enough time between the last Austin murder and the first Whitechapel murder for someone to have fled Texas, traveled to England, and begun killing again. He suggested that the killer had left Austin when the police investigation intensified, when the Pinkerton detectives arrived, when the risk of capture became too great. He had laid low for a while, perhaps in another city, perhaps in another country. And then, thousands of miles from his original hunting ground, he had resumed his campaign of terror. Devine's article caused a sensation. It was reprinted in newspapers across Texas and then across the United States. It was even picked up by some British newspapers, which found the theory both fascinating and disturbing. Could it be true? Could the monster terrorizing London have first honed his skills in Austin, Texas? The theory was debated in editorial pages, in saloons, in parlors and drawing rooms. Some dismissed it as sensationalist nonsense, a desperate attempt to connect two unrelated cases for the sake of selling newspapers. Others found it disturbingly plausible. The Pinkerton detectives, Muldoon and Bryce, were contacted by journalists and asked for their opinion. Muldoon was cautious. The similarities are notable, but they could also be coincidental. Serial killers often follow similar patterns because they share similar psychological profiles. That doesn't mean they're the same person. Bryce was more open to the possibility. I wouldn't rule it out. The Austin killer was intelligent, organized, and capable of evading capture for over a year, if he had the means to travel to England. It's not impossible that he could have started killing again in a different environment. But without concrete evidence, fingerprints, photographs, witness identifications, the theory remained pure speculation. The suspects who traveled, researchers and amateur detectives, began to dig through records, looking for men who had been in Austin during the murders and who had later traveled to England. Several candidates emerged. One, Dr. James Thompson. Thompson was a physician who had practiced in Austin during 1884 and 1885. He had treated several of the attack victims, including Irene Cross and Mary Ramey, in early 1886. Shortly after the murders stopped, Dr. Thompson had abruptly closed his practice and left Austin. He told colleagues he was moving to New York to pursue advanced medical training. Records showed that Dr. Thompson had indeed gone to New York, and from there he had traveled to London in 1887. He had medical knowledge, which would explain the precision of both the Austin attacks and the Ripper's organ removals. He had been in Austin during the murders and in London before the Ripper attacks began. He fit the profile. But there was a problem. Dr. Thompson had an alibi for at least two of the Austin murders. He had been attending medical conferences in Houston and San Antonio on those nights, with multiple witnesses placing him far from the crime scenes. The theory collapsed. 2. William Epperson. William Epperson was a merchant sailor who had docked in Galveston, Texas in 1884. He had traveled to Austin on several occasions during that year and into 1885. Buying supplies and conducting business. Merchant sailors were transient by nature, moving from port to port, familiar with different cities and cultures. Epperson had been in Austin during the period of the murders. And shipping records, she had sailed from Galveston to Liverpool, England in March 1886, arriving in England more than 2 years before the Ripper murders began. He could have been in London in 1888. But investigators could find no evidence connecting him to any of the crime scenes. No witnesses remembered seeing him near the victim households. No records placed him in Austin on the specific nights of the attacks. The connection was tantalizing but ultimately unsubstantiated. 3. Some theorists suggested that Morris, the black laborer who had been arrested and released in 1886, could have fled to England after his release and become Jack the Ripper. But this theory had obvious problems. First, Maurice had left Austin for Chicago, not England. There were no records of him traveling overseas. Second, multiple witnesses who saw Jack the Ripper described him as white. While some descriptions were vague, none suggested that the Ripper was a black man, something that would have been immediately noted in the racially conscious Victorian England. Third, Maurice had lived in Chicago until his death in 1899, with records documenting his presence there during the time of the Ripper murders. The theory was untenable. One of the most intriguing suspects was never positively identified. In the aftermath of the Austin murders, several witnesses mentioned seeing a foreign-looking man, described variously as Malay, East Indian, or dark-skinned but not Negro, working as a cook in various households around Austin. This man had been employed briefly by the Hall family in late 1884. He had also worked for a boarding house on East 6th Street in early 1885, and then he had vanished. No one knew his real name, John or Johnny in Austin, but this was likely an anglicized name given to him by employers who couldn't pronounce his real name. Interestingly, one of the suspects in the Jack the Ripper case was also described as a Malay cook by a witness named George Hutchinson, who claimed to have seen a suspicious man with one of the victims shortly before her death. Could they have been the same person? The theory was impossible to prove or disprove. Without a real name, without records, without photographs, the Malay cook remained a phantom, a suspect who existed only in fragmentary witness statements and speculation. Not everyone accepted the Austin Ripper connection. Skeptics pointed out significant differences between the two cases. Difference 1. The Austin killer used an axe, a heavy, blunt instrument that required physical strength. Jack the Ripper used a knife, a lighter, more precise instrument that required less strength but more skill. Why would the same killer switch weapons so dramatically? Supporters of the theory argued that the killer might have adapted to his environment. An axe would be more common in frontier Texas, where chopping wood was a daily necessity. A knife would be more common in urban London, where it could be more easily concealed. Difference 20. The Austin killer targeted servant women, both black and white, in their homes. Jack the Ripper targeted prostitutes, all white, on the streets. This suggested different hunting patterns, different psychological motivations. But supporters countered that both killers targeted the most vulnerable women available in their respective societies, women who were unlikely to be protected, unlikely to be missed immediately, unlikely to have their deaths thoroughly investigated. Difference 3. The Austin killer focused on crushing skulls and committing sexual assault. Jack the Ripper focused on abdominal mutilation and organ removal. These seemed like different signatures, different psychological expressions. Yet supporters noted that serial killers often evolved their methods over time, becoming more elaborate, more focused on specific acts as they developed their rituals. Perhaps the Austin killer had been in an early stage, still experimenting. Perhaps Jack the Ripper was the same man years later, with a more developed and specific set of violent compulsions. The truth is that we will never know for certain whether the Austin servant girl annihilator and Jack the Ripper were the same person. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The similarities are striking but not definitive. The theory remains one of the most fascinating what-ifs in the history of criminal investigation, a tantalizing possibility that can neither be proven nor dismissed. What we do know is this: both killers were never caught. Both killed vulnerable women with shocking brutality. Both operated during the same general era in a time before modern forensic science, before criminal databases, before the tools that would eventually allow law enforcement to track and capture serial killers. And both vanished into history, leaving behind only victims, survivors, and unanswered questions. Calling you so bile dup resolution or cliffhanger. The official conclusion: the case goes cold. In the official record of the Austin Police Department, the servant girl murders remain unsolved. The case file contains hundreds of pages of witness statements, evidence reports, autopsy records, and investigative notes. It contains the names of dozens of suspects who were questioned and released. It contains the plaster casts of boot prints that led nowhere. It contains photographs of crime scenes, grainy, sepia-toned images that show blood-stained floors and unmade beds and the places where women died. But it does not contain a solution. The file was officially closed in 1893, 7 years after the last murder, when the statute of limitations on most of the associated crimes expired. No one was ever charged, no one was ever convicted. The killer, whoever he was, got away with it. History has not been kind to the victims of the Austin servant girl annihilator. For decades, they were barely remembered at all. Their deaths were mentioned in passing in history books, if they were mentioned at all. The white victims Sue Hancock, Eula Phillips received more attention, their names preserved in newspaper archives and historical records. But the black victims, Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Rebecca Ramey, Orange Washington, were largely forgotten. Their lives had been considered let in 1885, and that judgment seemed to carry forward into history. But in recent years, there has been a growing effort to remember them, to honor them, to ensure that their stories are not lost. In 2015, the Austin History Center held an exhibition on the servant girl murders, focusing on the victims as individuals, as real people with lives and dreams and families who loved them. The exhibition included photographs, when they could be found. It included biographical information, pieced together from census records, church registries, and employment documents. It told the story of Molly Smith, who had survived slavery only to be murdered in the freedom that was supposed to be hers. It told the story of Eliza Shelley, who had dreamed of a better life and had saved money to buy fabric for a new dress she would never wear. It told the story of Rebecca Ramey, who had worked herself to exhaustion to support her daughter, who had fought to protect Mary even as she was dying. It told the story of Orange Washington, 17 years old, who had wanted to bring her sister to Austin so they could build a future together. These were the victims. These were the lives that mattered. These were the people who deserved to be remembered. The survivors carried their scars for the rest of their lives. Mary Ramey, who had been 11 years old when the killer murdered her mother and nearly killed her, lived to be 80 years old. She married. She had children and grandchildren. She lived a full life, by the standards of her time. But she never forgot that night in August 1885. In interviews late in her life, she spoke about the attack not in detail, because the memories were too painful, but in general terms. "I learned that evil is real," she said. "I learned that it can come for you even when you're innocent, even when you're just a child. But I also learned that you can survive it. You can carry the weight of it and still build a life." Irene Cross, who had been attacked in May 1885 and had survived with a fractured skull, lived until 1927. She never fully recovered from her injuries. She suffered from chronic headaches and seizures for the rest of her life. But she married a few years after the attack. She had 3 children. She became a midwife, helping other women bring life into the world. She rarely spoke about the attack, but those who knew her said that she had a deep empathy for people who had suffered trauma, a quiet understanding that could only come from having walked through the valley of the shadow of death herself. Moses Hancock, who had survived the Christmas Eve attack that killed his pregnant wife, did not fare as well. He spent the rest of his life drowning in guilt and grief. "I should have protected her," he told a friend years later. "I was right there. I was lying right beside her, and I couldn't stop him." No amount of reassurance could convince him that he was not to blame. He drank to silence the memories. He worked dangerous jobs, almost as if he was hoping for an accident that would release him from his pain. He died at 42, alone and broken. Gracie Vance left Austin and returned to Louisiana after her attack. She lived with relatives who resented her presence and considered her damaged goods. She never married. She never had children. She worked when she could, doing laundry and cleaning. But her injuries made it difficult to maintain steady employment. She died in 1902 at the age of 42 from complications of pneumonia. Her grave is unmarked. The Austin servant girl murders left a legacy that extended far beyond the individual victims and survivors. The case changed the way people thought about urban safety, about the vulnerability of women, about the limits of law enforcement. Before the murders, Austin had been a city that largely believed in its own safety, a place where people left their doors unlocked, where servant women slept in isolated outbuildings without fear, where the darkness was not something to be dreaded. After the murders, that innocence was gone. People installed locks. They bought weapons. They organized neighborhood watches. The servant house, once a common feature of Southern households, began to disappear. Employers started allowing their servants to sleep in the main house, or in nearby boarding houses, rather than in isolated outbuildings. The case also highlighted the deep racial inequalities of the era. When black servant women were being murdered, the response was slow and inadequate. When white women became victims, the response was immediate and overwhelming. This disparity did not go unnoticed in the black community. and it contributed to a growing awareness of the ways that racism shaped every aspect of life in the post-Reconstruction South, including who was protected and who was expendable. More than a century after the murders, people still debate what really happened. Who was the Austin servant girl annihilator? Was he Maurice, the laborer who was arrested and released, who maintained his innocence until his death? Was he the Malay cook, the mysterious foreign man who vanished after the murders stopped? Was he a doctor with anatomical knowledge and a hidden sadistic streak? Was he a merchant sailor who killed in different ports and then moved on before he could be caught? Or was he someone completely unexpected, a respected citizen, a family man, someone who hid his darkness behind a facade of normalcy? And was he connected to Jack the Ripper? Did he travel from Texas to London and resume his killing there? Or were they two different monsters, operating independently, in different parts of the world, united only by their capacity for evil? In recent decades, there have been attempts to use modern forensic science to solve the case. In 2014, a team of University of Texas at Austin reviewed the old case files, looking for evidence that could be subjected to DNA testing. They found very little. Most of the physical evidence had been lost or destroyed over the years. The blood-stained clothing, the fabric samples, the hair and fiber evidence, all of it was gone. What remained were the plaster casts of boot prints, which could not yield DNA, and the written records, witness statements, autopsy reports, police notes, which could provide historical context but no biological evidence. The researchers concluded that without new evidence, the case could not be solved using modern forensic techniques. The killer's identity would remain a mystery. Even now, nearly 140 years after the murders, questions linger. Why did the killer target certain women specifically? Was it because they were vulnerable and accessible? Or was there something more, a class resentment, a racial hatred, a specific psychological fixation? Why did the attacks escalate from black victims to white victims? Was it because the killer was growing bolder? Or was there a different motive for the later attacks? Why did the murders stop so suddenly in December 1885? Did the killer die? Did he leave Austin? Was he frightened by the intensity of the police investigation? Or did he simply decide to stop, to walk away from his campaign of terror and return to a normal life, carrying his secrets to the grave? And if he survived, if he lived into old age, did he ever feel remorse? Did he ever think about the women he had killed, the lives he had destroyed, the children he had orphaned? Or did he remain cold and unfeeling to the end, a monster in human form who never experienced guilt or regret? We will never know. Of all the victims, perhaps the most tragic was Sue Hancock and the child she carried. Sue had been 7 months pregnant when the killer murdered her on Christmas Eve 1885. She had been planning for the baby's arrival. She had sewn tiny clothes. She had chosen names. William if it was a boy, Sarah if it was a girl. She and Moses had talked endlessly about the future they would have, the family they would build. And in a single night, all of it was taken away. Sue was 24 years old when she died. Her baby never had a chance to take a first breath, to open its eyes, to live. They were buried together in Oakwood Cemetery, in a shared grave marked by a simple headstone. Susan Hancock, an infant, died December 24, 1885, taken too soon. Moses visited the grave every week for the first year after her death, and then, consumed by grief and guilt, he stopped going. He could not bear to face the reminder of what he had lost. The Austin servant girl murders remind us that evil is real, not metaphorical evil. Real, tangible, human evil, the kind that walks on two legs and breathes and makes choices. The killer was not a supernatural monster. He was a man. He lived among other people. He probably had a job, maybe a family. He might have gone to church on Sundays. He might have smiled and nodded to his neighbors in the street. And in the darkness, he became something else. He became a predator who stalked the most vulnerable members of his community and destroyed them for reasons we will never fully understand. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case. Not the violence itself, though that was horrific enough, but the ordinariness of the killer. He was not obviously insane. He was not frothing at the mouth or raving in the streets. He was organized, intelligent, patient. He knew how to blend in. He knew how to avoid suspicion. He knew how to get away with murder. And he did. It would be easy to forget the Austin servant girl murders. They happened nearly a century and a half ago. The victims are long dead. The killer is long dead, whoever he was. The case has no neat resolution, no satisfying conclusion. But we remember because the victims deserve to be remembered. Molly Smith deserves to be remembered, not as a statistic, not as the first victim, but as a 25-year-old woman who had survived slavery and was trying to build a life in freedom. Aluza Shelley deserves to be remembered, not as victim number 2, but as a young woman who sang hymns while she worked and saved money for a new dress. Rebecca Ramey deserves to be remembered, not just as a murder victim, but as a mother who fought to protect her daughter with her last breath. Orange Washington deserves to be remembered, not as the last name on a list, but as a 17-year-old girl who was saving money to bring her sister to Austin, who dreamed of a better future. Sue Hawk and her unborn child deserve to be remembered, not as symbols of tragedy, but as real people whose lives were stolen on Christmas Eve. We remember them because their lives mattered. We remember them because forgetting them would be a second death, a final erasure of their existence. The Austin servant girl annihilator was never caught. His name is not known. His face was never seen clearly enough to be described. He existed as a shadow, a phantom, a nightmare that terrorized a city for over a year and then vanished. Was he Jack the Ripper? Probably not, but we can never be completely certain. Was he Maurice? Possibly, though the evidence was never strong enough to prove it. Was he the Malay cook, the mysterious foreign man who disappeared? Maybe. Or was he someone else entirely? Someone whose name never even appeared in the investigation, who was never suspected, who lived out his life in obscurity and took his secrets to the grave. We will never know, and perhaps, in the end, his identity matters less than what he represents. He represents the darkness that exists in some human hearts. He represents the vulnerability of the innocent. He represents the limits of justice, the times when the guilty escape punishment and the victims are left without vindication. But he also represents something else. He represents our determination to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that even when justice fails, the victims are not forgotten. To Mary Ramey, who carried the scars of that August night for 80 years, you survived. You built a life despite the horror you endured. You are not defined by what happened to you, but by how you lived afterward. To Irene Cross, who turned her own suffering into compassion for others, you took the darkness that was done to you and transformed it into light for other people. That is courage. That is grace. To Gracie, life was shattered and never fully healed. You deserve better. The world failed you, but that does not diminish your worth or your humanity. To Moses Hancock, who died weighted down by guilt that was never his to carry, you were a victim too. You did not fail. You survived an attack that should have killed you. Your wife's death was not your fault. And to all the others who lived through that terrible year in Austin, who heard the screams in the night, who feared for their safety, who were changed forever by the knowledge that evil could strike without warning, you endured. You survived. You carried on. That is not nothing. That is everything. More than a century has passed since the Austin servant girl murders. We have developed sophisticated forensic techniques. We have criminal databases and DNA analysis and psychological profiling. We understand serial killers better than we did in 1885. But we still cannot fully answer the question that Chief Lucy and the Pinkerton detectives and the terrified citizens of an asked themselves in 1885. Why does someone become a killer? Why does someone choose to inflict suffering on innocent people? Why does someone target the most vulnerable, the most defenseless, those who pose no threat? The answers we have are partial and incomplete: childhood trauma, brain abnormalities, psychological disorders, power and control, sexual gratification. These explanations help us understand the mechanics of serial killing, the how. But they do not fully answer the why. They do not explain the moment when a human being makes the choice to become a monster. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps there is a darkness at the heart of some human actions that cannot be fully illuminated, cannot be fully understood, cannot be rationalized or explained away. Perhaps all we can do is acknowledge that darkness, protect ourselves from it as best we can, and remember those who fall victim to it. This case reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight. It reminds us that the people who are most vulnerable, the poor, the marginalized, those without power or protection, are often the first to suffer and the last to receive justice. It reminds us that serial killers do not always look like monsters. They look like ordinary people. They blend in. It reminds us that even in the modern era, with all our technology and science, some mysteries remain unsolved, some killers are never caught, some justice is never served. But it also reminds us that we have a duty to remember, a duty to the victims to honor their lives and their humanity, a duty to the survivors to acknowledge their suffering and their resilience, a duty to history to preserve the truth even when it is uncomfortable, even when it reveals the worst of what humans are capable of. The Austin servant girl annihilator killed at least 4 women and injured at least 4 more. He terrorized a city, he escaped justice, but he did not escape memory. We remember his victims. We remember their names. We remember that their lives had value, that their deaths were tragedies, that they deserved better than what they received. And as long as we remember, the killer's final victory, the victory of erasure, of forgetting, is denied. The story of the Austin servant girl annihilator is a dark one. It is a story of violence and fear and loss. It is a story without a satisfying ending, without justice, without closure. But it is also a story of resilience, of survivors who rebuilt their lives despite unimaginable trauma, of communities that came together in the face of terror, of investigators who did their best with the limited tools available to them, of descendants who have fought to ensure that the victims are remembered and honored. And it is a reminder that we must remain vigilant, that we must protect the vulnerable, that we must never become complacent about the presence of evil in the world. The darkness is real, but so is the light of memory, of justice pursued even when it is not achieved, of compassion for those who suffer. Thank you for listening to this case. If you found it meaningful, please leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you think happened. Tell me which theory you believe. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories like this one. Stories that need to be told. Stories that should not be forgotten. Sem.